The morning of our anniversary, I woke up alone. That wasn't unusual. Ron was always the first one out of bed, already dressed and gone before the sun had fully made up its mind about rising. I used to hate it, back when we first moved in together, that cold stretch of mattress beside me, the indent of his body already cooling by the time my eyes opened. Now, 3 years into marriage, I'd made a kind of peace with it. Ron Rice was many things, but a man who lingered in bed was not one of them. What was unusual was the silence. No coffee smell drifting up from downstairs. No low murmur of the morning news he always left running in the kitchen. No sound of his car idling in the driveway before backing out. Just the house, sitting around me like a held breath, and the pale gray light of a February morning pressing against the curtains. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, counting the small cracks in the plaster that I kept meaning to fix and never did. Our anniversary, 2 years, the church, the small ceremony, the look on Ron's face when I walked toward him, that expression he wore sometimes, the one that made him look less like the composed, certain man the rest of the world saw, and more like someone who couldn't quite believe his luck. I smiled at the ceiling, alone and a little silly about it. Then I reached for my phone. No message from Ron. I told myself that was fine. He was probably in back-to-back meetings. His firm had been running him ragged for weeks. I told myself he'd call by noon, or send something small. He wasn't a grand gesture man, not usually. Ron showed love in other ways. A filled gas tank when he noticed mine was low, a glass of water left on my nightstand, the way he always remembered exactly how I took my coffee, even when I changed it on a whim and never mentioned the change aloud. But noon came and went, then 3 o'clock, then 5. By the time evening rolled around, I'd moved through a fairly complete emotional itinerary. Patient understanding, mild concern, gentle annoyance, and finally, the quiet, specific kind of hurt that doesn't announce itself loudly, but sits behind your sternum like something lodged there. I made dinner for two anyway. It felt important not to give up on the ritual before it had even been confirmed dead. Pasta, his favorite, the one with the lemon and capers that I'd spent 40 minutes perfecting about a year into our marriage, until he'd kissed the side of my head and told me it tasted exactly like a restaurant we'd gone to on a trip, years before we were anything more than friends. I set the table, lit the candle, the short, squat beeswax one we'd bought from a market stall on our honeymoon and that I'd been saving for something significant. The candle burned down to a nub. I ate alone. Ron came home at 8:30, heard the familiar sequence. Key, click, a soft drag of the door over the hallway rug, the thud of his bag on the bench, then his footsteps, and then him in the kitchen doorway, still in his coat, looking at the table with its cleared plates and melted candle and the wine I'd poured for him, and then drunk myself, somewhere around the 7 o'clock hour. He looked tired. That was the first thing I noticed. Not guilty tired. Not I forgot something important tired. Just genuinely, bone-deep exhausted. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. His jaw was unshaved in a way that wasn't strategic. "Sean," he said. "Hey." My voice came out more neutral than I felt. I was good at that, the neutral voice. I'd grown up in a house where feelings needed translating before they were safe to say aloud, and some habits survive long past the circumstances that created them. Ron crossed the kitchen and kissed the top of my head, the way he always did. His coat was cold from outside and smelled like city air and the particular wool and cedar scent that I associated, entirely involuntarily, with the feeling of being home. "You cooked?" he said, looking at the pan still on the stove. "I did. It smells incredible." He moved to the stove, lifted the lid on the pot where I'd kept the extra portion warm. "Is there enough for—" "I made enough for two, yes." Something in my tone must have shifted, because he set the lid down carefully and turned to look at me. Really look at me. Ron had a way of doing that, not scanning, not glancing, but actually settling his attention on a person like they were the only thing in the room. It used to make me feel seen in a way that was almost unbearable, back when I was still trying to pretend I didn't love him. "Long day?" I offered. "Very." He pulled out a chair and sat down, not across from me, but beside me, close enough that our shoulders merely touched. He pinched the bridge of his nose for a moment. "The Hartley case fell apart this afternoon, completely. We're filing an emergency motion tomorrow morning, and I've been in calls since 2 o'clock. "Okay," I nodded. I knew about the Hartley case. He'd been stressed about it for weeks. I knew what it meant when his work unraveled at the seams. I knew all of that, and still the evening sat between us, undiscussed, and the candle stub was there on the table, like a small piece of evidence. He didn't mention the date. I watched him eat, watched him slowly unknot from the day, watched the tension in his shoulders drop by degrees. He talked about the case a little, and I listened, and somewhere in the listening I made the decision, the one I often made with Ron, which was to let the thing go unspoken for now. Not forever. Just for now. He was exhausted. The day had been what it had been. Tomorrow I would say something, calmly and clearly, and we would talk about it the way we'd learned to talk about things. I was proud of that, the talking. We hadn't always been good at it. He helped me wash up, standing at the sink with his sleeves rolled and his shoulder against mine, and when we were done, he held me from behind for a long moment with his chin on the top of my head. And I let myself lean into him, even while some part of me was still quietly, privately hurt. "You're quiet tonight," he said into my hair. "Tired." "Yeah." His arms tightened a little. "Me too." We went to bed. He was asleep within minutes. I could tell by the change in his breathing, the way his whole body finally let go. I lay in the dark beside him and stared at the ceiling and thought about the candle, and the pasta, and the 2 years, and the way his face had looked in the church. I didn't sleep for a long time. I had rebuilt the whole event into something manageable in my head. Ron had forgotten. It happened. He was under enormous pressure, and the date had slipped, and it was one evening, not the whole marriage. We were fine. We were going to be fine. I told myself all of that in the bathroom mirror, while the shower ran hot and the steam rose around me. I told myself it with conviction. I mostly believed it. What I didn't do was bring it up at breakfast, because Ron was already on his phone when I came down, already half-dressed in his work clothes, already 3/4 of the way out the door mentally. He looked at me over the phone with an expression that was apologetic and helpless in equal measure, and I waved a hand. "Go. It's fine," and poured myself coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the neighbor's cat walk the top of the fence with great dignity. He left with a quick kiss to the corner of my mouth and a muttered promise to be home by 7. The house settled back into its morning quiet. I sat with my coffee for a while, and I thought about the early days, back when we weren't married, back when we weren't even quite friends yet, back when Ron Rice was just the infuriatingly composed man who'd started attending the same early morning running group, and who had a habit of finishing exactly 2 minutes ahead of everyone else without appearing to try. I disliked him on principle at first. He was too certain, too contained, the kind of man who made you feel slightly chaotic by comparison. It took me a long time to realize that the certainty wasn't arrogance. It was just how he was built. A kind of bedrock steadiness that had nothing to do with thinking well of himself, and everything to do with knowing exactly what he valued and not being particularly anxious about it. When he turned that quality toward me, the effect was difficult to overstate. Being known by someone that certain is a very specific experience. It's terrifying and settling at the same time. I'd loved him for 3 years before I said it aloud. He'd been in love with me for roughly the same amount of time, though neither of us knew the other felt it. And we'd spent an extremely inefficient couple of years being very good friends and extremely poor communicators. The coffee went cold. I poured it out and made a second cup. I was going to say something tonight, calmly, the way we'd learned. He was home by 7:15, I'll give him that. I was on the sofa with a book I wasn't reading when I heard his key. I listened to the sequence, door, bag, footsteps, and I set the book down and I thought, okay, here we go. Calmly, he came into the sitting room and stopped just inside the doorway, and something shifted on his face. Not guilt exactly, more like a recognition. His eyes moved around the room and came back to me, and he looked for just a moment like a man doing a rapid internal calculation. "Sean." "Hi." He sat down in the armchair across from me, not beside me this time. Across, which was the configuration we defaulted to when something needed to be said directly. I appreciated that he knew. Even without me telling him explicitly what this was about, he knew enough to sit in the talking chair. "You're about to tell me I did something wrong," he said. "I'm about to tell you something that hurt my feelings. Whether or not it was wrong is somewhat beside the point." He nodded slowly. He had that look on his face, the listening one. Fully present. Waiting. I took a breath. It was our anniversary yesterday. The silence that followed was not a long one, but it had a quality to it, a density. I watched his face. Watched the moment land, watched him receive it. His expression didn't collapse into performance, Ron wasn't a performer. It simply changed, became something quieter and more complicated. I know, he said. I blinked. You know? I know it was our anniversary. I stared at him. You didn't say anything. You didn't. There was nothing. No message, no call. You came home at 8:30 and you didn't. I know. His voice was level, but underneath the level there was something strained. I know, Sean. I'm aware of exactly how yesterday looked. Then why? Because it was a catastrophic day at work, and I was in back-to-back calls from 2 in the afternoon, and I came home, and I was running on about 4 hours of sleep, and I dropped the ball. The way I'd planned to handle it, the timing of it, all of it went sideways because of the case, and I came home, and He stopped. Something moved through his expression. I looked at the table. I saw the candle. I knew. I didn't say anything. I was watching him too carefully to speak. I've been planning something since January, he said. The words arrived in the room and rearranged something. Since January, I repeated. We talked about going away. You mentioned it last year, the coastal place, the one you saw in that article. I booked it. A pause. I booked it back in January for this weekend, Friday to Sunday, because I knew February was going to be brutal with the case, and I wanted to do it properly, not just dinner on the night, but an actual. He ran a hand over his jaw. The plan was to tell you on the day, yesterday, and then leave on Friday. I had a card. I had the reservation confirmation's been on my phone for 6 weeks. And yesterday fell apart, and I came home, and you were so quiet, and I knew the damage was already done, and I couldn't figure out how to. He stopped again. You couldn't figure out how to what? My voice was much softer now than when we'd started. How to produce the weekend away without it looking like I'd only organized it after the fact, as damage control. He looked at me steadily. I didn't want you to think I'd forgotten, and then scrambled. But the alternative was letting you keep sitting there, thinking I'd simply not remembered it all, and I couldn't. A small, frustrated exhale. I couldn't do that either. The sitting room held very still around us. I looked at the man across from me, this infuriatingly composed, genuinely exhausted, clearly mortified man who had apparently spent the last several weeks quietly organizing a weekend by the coast, and had then had the singular misfortune of his professional life imploding on the exact date he'd needed it not to. You've been planning this since January, I said again. Something in my chest was doing something complicated. The hotel confirmation is dated the 14th of January. I can show you. I don't need you to show me. I know you don't. His voice dipped slightly. I need you to believe me. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I stood up from the sofa and crossed the room, and I sat on the arm of his chair. Not gracefully, it wasn't a graceful gesture. The arm of the chair was not really designed for sitting on, and he shifted automatically to make it less awkward, his arm coming around my waist with the ease of long practice. You absolute disaster, I said. A small exhale, almost a laugh. Yeah, you sat through dinner not mentioning any of this. You seemed like you needed space to be quietly furious first. I wasn't furious. You were absolutely furious. I was hurt, I said, with dignity. There's a difference. There is, he agreed. I'm sorry about the hurt. I should have, even in the middle of everything, I should have sent a message, something, to at least mark the day. I leaned into him a little, my shoulder against his chest. You should have. I know. But I also should have asked, instead of sitting there performing patience while actually being quietly martyred about it. We're both terrible at this. We're both getting better, he said. His arm tightened around me. That's the whole point. We sat like that for a while, a little awkwardly. The chair arm genuinely wasn't comfortable, but neither of us moved. Outside, the February dark pressed against the windows, and the house did its quiet house sounds around us. Where is it? I asked eventually. Coastal place, about 2.5 hours, right on the water. A pause. They have a restaurant. I've looked at the menu approximately 40 times. I laughed, something loosening in my chest. Of course you have. The room has a fireplace. I know you always wanted a room with a fireplace. I had said that, once, in passing, at least a year ago. He had stored it. Of course he had. Ron. The arm around my waist shifted, and his other hand came up and turned my chin gently toward him, and he looked at me the way he'd looked at me in the church, that look that was too full to quite contain itself. And he said, simply and completely, I know. I love you too. I'm sorry yesterday was what it was. I'm sorry I martyred silently instead of just asking. We're both disasters. We're getting better, I said, echoing him. He kissed me, slow and certain the way he did everything. Friday came with a gray, cold morning, the kind that feels like winter has made a point of going out memorably. I packed a bag while Ron loaded the car, and there was something easy and companionable about the process. The calls of what to bring, the easy negotiation of the bathroom counter, his hands taking my bag when I came downstairs and swinging it over one shoulder like it was nothing. We drove through the city and out of it, through the flat, bare fields of February that look either bleakly beautiful or just bleak depending on your mood. And my mood that morning was the former. The heated seats were on. Ron had his hands easy on the wheel. The radio was playing something low. I looked out the window at the landscape moving past and felt with a clarity that sometimes catches you off guard that I was content. Completely and specifically content in the small moving space of a car on a winter morning with this man. You're staring at me, he said, eyes on the road. I'm looking at the scenery. The scenery is to your left. I'm to your right. You're part of the scenery. A small smile, almost reluctant, in the way his smiles always were, like they'd been held back until they were absolutely necessary and then couldn't be stopped. Flattering. It was meant to be. He reached across the gear shift and found my hand without looking, threaded his fingers through mine, and settled our joined hands on the center console. We drove like that for the next hour and a half. The coastal hotel was exactly what the photos had suggested, and somehow also more than they'd conveyed. It sat at the edge of a headland, with the sea below it, gray and cold and vast, and in February, almost entirely theirs. The car park had 4 other cars in it. The lobby smelled like wood smoke and something faintly floral. The man at the front desk gave us a room key and a quiet smile and asked if we were celebrating anything. Ron said, without missing a beat, our anniversary. And something in his voice was so settled when he said it. Not performed, not announced, just completely certain, that I had to look at the pattern on the carpet for a moment to get my face back under control. The room had the fireplace. Of course it did, because Ron had booked it in January, and he doesn't do things by halves. It also had a window that looked directly over the water, and a bed with approximately twice as many pillows as any reasonable person needed, and a bathtub that I made a mental note about for later. We dropped our bags, and Ron immediately went to the fireplace and crouched in front of it, with the specific focus he brought to any practical problem. I stood at the window and looked out at the sea, charcoal and pewter, the waves deliberate and slow from this distance, a single seabird tracing a long arc across the gray sky. It's beautiful, I said. Hold on. The sound of a match, the smell of it. Then, okay, now look. I looked at him instead, crouched by a small fire that was just beginning to take, his face lit warmly from below, looking up at me with an expression that was simple and undefended. This man, I thought, this absolute infuriating particular man. I meant the sea, I said. I know. He stood, dusting his hands on his jeans, but you were looking at me anyway. I was. We walked down to the shore in the afternoon, bundled into coats, the wind blowing in from the water cold and insistent. There was almost no one else on the beach, just the gray shingle and the great gray sea, and the two of us walking close together, our shoulders touching, hands shoved in our own pockets, because even holding hands was impractical against this particular wind. Ron talked about the case a little. It had been handed off to a junior partner, and the emergency motion had succeeded, and there was still a long road ahead of it, but the acute crisis was over. I talked about the project I'd been working on, the commission that had been giving me grief for weeks, the small breakthrough I'd had on Wednesday that had made the rest of it fall into place. We talked about his sister, who was expecting her first child in April. We talked about the neighbor's cat and its consistent dignity. We talked the way you talk with someone you know well, not performing conversation, but simply existing in it together, letting it go where it wanted. At some point, the beach curved around a headland, and we were briefly sheltered from the wind, and Ron stopped walking and looked out at the water, and I stopped beside him. I want to say something, he said. Okay. He was quiet for a moment, not searching for words exactly, more like organizing them, making sure they were right before he said them. This was so characteristic of him that it was almost comfortable to wait through. I know yesterday was hard, he began. Not just the anniversary, but these weeks. The case, the exhaustion, me not being present the way I should have been. I know I've been somewhere else, and you've been managing around it. I started to say it was fine, but he turned to look at me before I could, and something in his expression said, "Let me finish." "I don't want you to manage around me," he said. "I don't want to be the variable you make allowances for. I want—" a small pause. "I want to be the person who shows up, Sean. Consistently. Not perfectly, but consistently. And I haven't been doing that lately, and I'm aware of it. And he seemed to run out of sentence structure, which for Ron was genuinely unusual. He was not a man who ran out of sentence structure. I watched his profile against the gray sky and felt something large and warm moving in my chest. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. He looked at me. "I'm not managing around you, not the way you mean. I married you knowing that some months your work would eat you alive. I knew that going in. We talked about it." I shifted a little on the shingle, the stones unstable underfoot. I was hurt on Wednesday, that's true, and I should have said something instead of performing stoic patience. But that's my thing to work on, not a verdict on the marriage. I paused. "You planned this since January." "I did. That's not a man who's not showing up." He was quiet for a moment, looking at me. The wind came back around the headland and moved through his hair, and the sea was doing its huge and different thing behind him. "You always do that," he said eventually. "Do what?" "Find the version of events that's most generous to me." "I find the version that's accurate." I tilted my head. "They happen to be the same thing fairly often." Something passed through his face that was very close to undone. He reached out and put his hand on the side of my jaw, his thumb against my cheekbone, and looked at me from a distance of about 6 inches with that expression, the one that was too full for its container. 2 years, he said. 2 years, I agreed. I'd do it again from the start. The whole long stupid beginning, the running group, the 3 years of pretending, all of it, completely certain, because it made this. I covered his hand with mine. The wind pushed at us both. The sea went on with its enormous indifferent business in the background, and we stood in this small shelter of headland, and I thought about the church again. That moment, walking toward him, the look on his face. And I thought about the kitchen, and the candle, and the sitting room, and him saying, "I need you to believe me. Ron?" I'd do it again too, for the record. He kissed me there on the beach, in the cold, tasting of sea air, his hands on either side of my face. And it was clumsy and slightly difficult with all the wind, and not the most graceful moment of our marriage by any standard. But it was ours, completely and specifically ours, and I thought that was about the best thing you could say about any moment. Dinner that night was the restaurant Ron had looked at 40 times. We dressed up a little, not dramatically, but the nicer versions of ourselves. I wore the dark shirt he'd told me once, in passing, that he liked the color of. He wore the watch his father had given him, which only came out for significant occasions. We sat by the window with the dark sea below us, and candles that were not burning down to stubs because of sadness, but were burning cheerfully and on purpose. The food was extraordinary. We ate too much and said so, and ate a little more anyway. He had wine. I stuck to water, because I'd been slightly headachy all day, and had learned to read my body's weather warnings. He refilled my glass without being asked, his hand steady on the jug. We talked about everything and nothing. Our friends, their various dramas. The holiday we'd vaguely discussed taking in the autumn. Somewhere warmer. Somewhere with an airport rather than a car journey. His mother's birthday, and the annual question of what on earth to get her. My brother in the new flat, and whether it would actually happen this time or collapse again at the final stage the way it had twice before. At some point between the main course and dessert, when the conversation had drifted into comfortable quietness, he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. Just rested it there. He wasn't looking at me with any particular significance. He was looking out at the dark window, at the reflection of the room floating over the black water, but his hand was warm and steady and present. "What?" I said. "Nothing." Still looking at the window. Just a small pause. Happy. I turned my hand over under his, so our palms were together. "Yeah," I said. "Me too." Later, in the room with the fire burned low and the windows full of dark sky, I lay awake for a while with Ron asleep beside me, and the sound of the sea, low and constant and enormous, coming through the glass. I thought about what he'd said on the beach. I'd do it again from the start. I believed him absolutely. This was one of the more disorienting things about Ron. There was no part of him that dissembled about what he felt. When he said something like that, it wasn't performance or reassurance or the thing you say in a romantic moment. It was a statement of fact, catalogued and settled. He'd do it again. Of course he would. He was Ron. I thought about the January 14th confirmation on his phone. 6 weeks he'd been carrying that, thinking about it, anticipating this weekend. While the case was eating him alive, while the sleepless nights were stacking up, while I was watching him move through the house like a man who'd forgotten where the pause button was, he'd had this in his pocket, this small, careful plan. I thought about the card he'd mentioned. There was a card. I hadn't asked about it, and he hadn't produced it, and perhaps that conversation was still ahead of us, or perhaps it had found its way into the weekend in other forms. The beach, the fire, the dinner, his hand over mine. Perhaps the card was already redundant by the time we got here. But I thought I might ask about it. Tomorrow, over breakfast, maybe. Not because I needed the piece of paper, but because I found I wanted to know what he'd written. Ron wrote differently than he talked, more willing to put things plainly, that he might qualify aloud. I'd saved every note he'd ever left me, the whole archive of them, in a box in the wardrobe at home. 3 years of leaving the house notes and grocery annotations, and the occasional longer thing on better paper when something mattered enough to write down. The sea kept going. The fire was just coals now, dim and orange. I shifted closer to him, fitting myself into the familiar configuration, his arm moving in sleep to accommodate me, the way it always did, some automatic adjustment, some buried knowledge his sleeping body had of where I was supposed to be. His breathing was slow and even. The shadows under his eyes had been lighter tonight at dinner. He'd slept 9 hours last night, which I knew because I'd been awake for some of them, and had watched the quality of his sleep with something close to relief. He needed this. We had both needed this. I pressed my face briefly against his shoulder and thought, 2 years. An entirely inadequate period of time, and also, somehow, the whole of everything. Before, Ron felt like something that had happened to a slightly different, slightly less organized version of me. After, Ron was simply what my life was. The house, and the cold mattress at 5 in the morning, and the filled gas tanks, and the coffee remembered exactly right, and the notes in the box in the wardrobe. I closed my eyes. Outside, the sea kept up its endless lateral conversation with the shore. I listened to it, and to his breathing, and to the small sounds of the hotel settling around us, and I fell asleep between one wave and the next. Saturday morning, the sun came through. Not dramatically. It was February, so it was the modest, cold gold kind of sun, the kind that doesn't promise anything but is genuinely welcome for having shown up at all. It came sideways through the curtains and put a stripe of light across the bed and across Ron's face, and I watched him wake up. He woke up the same way he did everything, without drama, without the long, slow drag that characterized my own mornings. Eyes open, a short breath, aware. He blinked at the ceiling once and then turned his head and found me already watching him, which made him look briefly caught out in a way that I enjoyed unreasonably. "Good morning," I said. "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough." He made a sound that was half protest, half resignation, and pulled me closer, tucking my head under his chin. His morning voice was different from his daytime voice, lower, less curated. I liked it. I always had. "The sun is out," I said. We should do something with it before it changes its mind." 5 more minutes. "You said that last week and got up at 4:45. A low exhale that was almost a laugh. "That was different. That was work." "This is the anniversary trip you've been planning since January. Surely that warrants at least a similar degree of motivation." "It warrants staying exactly here for 5 minutes first." His arm tightened. Then motivation. I stayed. 5 minutes, and then a few more than 5. The sun moving its stripe across the wall, while we lay in the warmth of the room, and the sound of the sea went on below us. I thought about nothing in particular. Just the room, and the light, and him. Eventually he stirred, and then we were up, and the morning reorganized itself around coffee brought up from the restaurant, and the business of showers, and the small pleasant arguments of 2 people sharing a bathroom not quite designed for 2. He stole my spot at the mirror. I used his expensive face wash, because mine had turned out to be nearly empty when I packed it. We negotiated and conceded and laughed about things that weren't especially funny, but felt funny because of the mood of the morning. Breakfast in the restaurant again. He had the full-cooked option with the dedication of a man who'd been existing on desk food for weeks. I had eggs and toast, and drank an amount of coffee that I privately felt was justifiable. The room was fuller than last night. A few other couples, a family with 2 small children engaged in the silent warfare of siblings, an older man reading a newspaper with the concentration of someone for whom this was still the primary news medium. After breakfast, he produced the card. I hadn't asked yet. It simply appeared set on the table beside my coffee cup while I was looking out the window at the morning sea, which was an entirely different proposition in sunlight, blue-gray now, glittering, the waves catching light. I looked down at it. My name on the envelope in his handwriting, which was architect neat in a way that still surprised me given that he was a lawyer rather than an architect. But there it was. Sean in his particular hand. I was going to give it to you on Wednesday, he said, when I got home. I know. I picked it up. Can I open it now? That's generally what envelopes are for. I opened it. Inside was a card. Simple, not fussy, the kind he always chose because he had a deep-seated skepticism of cards with too much going on. And inside the card was his writing, filling most of the space in a way that told me he'd had things to say, and had said them. I am not going to transcribe it here, because those words belong to a different kind of private, but I will say this. He wrote what he never quite managed to say aloud, which was the full, unqualified version of it. Not the settled certainty of his daily love, which was real and consistent, and enough, but the underneath of it. The version that was, despite everything, still a little odd. He had written, I still don't know how I got here with you, but I intend to spend a very long time being glad I did. I read it twice and folded it back into the envelope. When I looked up, he was watching me with that expression, the one that was too full for its container. You had this since January too? I said. I wrote it the week I made the booking. Ron, I know. You absolute disaster, I know, you said. I was going to say romantic. He blinked, and then something shifted on his face, a small surprised warmth, and he reached across the table, and I took his hand. Thank you, I said, for planning this, for all of it, for January 14th. It wasn't supposed to look like panic management. It doesn't. It looks like you. I turned the card over in my other hand. It looks exactly like you. He squeezed my hand. Outside the window, the cold February sea went about its dazzling business in the unaccountable morning sun. We walked for most of the day. The headland had a path that traced its edge, and we followed it for miles, up past the hotel, out along the cliff top where the grass was winter yellow and the wind was still brisk but had lost some of its earlier ferocity. Down again toward a small cove that took us 20 minutes of careful scrambling to reach and which rewarded us with total, perfect solitude. The cove was shingle and dark rock, tucked below the cliff face, sheltered enough that the wind was mostly above us. The sea here was different, calmer, closer, washing in and out over smooth stones with a sound like a long exhale. We sat on a flat rock, and Ron took off his shoes, which I thought was insane in February, but which I had also absolutely seen coming, and he walked to the water's edge and stood there with his bare feet on the cold stones and his face into what little sun there was. You're going to get hypothermia of the feet, I said. Unlikely. His eyes were closed. He looked utterly at peace in the particular way that only the outdoors ever produced in him. His office self, his courtroom self, even his home self, all had a slight maintained quality. This version, feet on cold stones, eyes closed, was the most unguarded. Happy? I asked. Very. He opened one eye to look at me. You should come in. I really genuinely should not. The cold is the point. The cold is the problem. He laughed, and I stayed on my rock, and he stood at the water's edge for a few more minutes with his face tilted up, and I watched him and thought about January 14th and the card and the stripe of morning sun across the bed and all the years before this that had wound their strange particular way to here, to a cove below a headland in February, with this man barefoot on cold stones, laughing at my unreasonable preference for sensation in my extremities. When he came back and sat beside me, his feet were emphatically cold, and I said so while he put his shoes back on, and he agreed entirely, and this somehow made us both laugh for much longer than it warranted. We ate lunch at a small place we found when we eventually made it back along the cliff path and down to the small town at the headland's base, a counter cafe with mismatched chairs and a blackboard menu, and soup that arrived in deep bowls that were too hot to hold properly. We ate at a table by the window and watched the street outside, and talked about nothing important for a long time. He told me a story about his first year of law school that I'd never heard, something involving a moot court competition and an argument he'd been completely certain about and entirely wrong on, which had apparently been a formative experience in the art of being wrong gracefully. I told him about a summer I'd spent at 16 trying to teach myself to paint, with results that were, by my own admission, catastrophic. and the particular painting of our dog that had been so bad it had reportedly made my mother feel sad for the dog. We had known each other for years, and there were still stories. I thought that was one of the gifts of a long friendship before the rest of it. The reservoir of untold things, the years of life, lived before the mutual orbit that kept producing new material. The afternoon turned to early evening while we sat there. We ordered more coffee. The cafe owner, a woman of about 60, with excellent earrings and the unhurried quality of someone who ran a business on her own terms, came to ask if we needed anything else with the manner of someone who was, in fact, offering permission to stay as long as we liked. We stayed until it was properly dark outside, and the streetlights were doing their warm orange work on the wet pavement. Walking back to the hotel, our shoulders were close and our breath made small clouds. The sea was audible but invisible, its presence felt more than seen, its sound a background note beneath the crunch of our footsteps. He put his arm around my shoulders, and I put mine around his waist, and we walked back up the hill like that, a little awkward with it, adjusting pace, navigating each other's rhythm. "This is not optimal walking configuration," he said. "No. We could hold hands. We could." Neither of us changed the configuration. The second night, the fire was going again. I'd built it this time, with questionable technique and a lot of persistence, and eventual, genuine success, which Ron had observed from the armchair with a studied neutrality that was itself a form of faith, and that pleased me disproportionately. The room was warm, and the windows were dark, and the sea was out there doing its enormous thing. We'd had room service rather than the restaurant. Something lower key, less occasion, more comfort. Ate on the bed, which was definitely against some rule somewhere, and that made it better. He'd found something on his laptop to watch, an old nature documentary about deep-sea creatures, which was exactly the kind of thing we both found unexpectedly absorbing at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, or a Saturday night. I'd lost track of what day it technically was, which was its own kind of luxury. The documentary ended, and we left the laptop playing something else quietly in the background, and lay in the dark, with the fire going down, and talked the way you talk late at night, when the day's careful architecture has relaxed, and things you didn't plan to say come out easier. He told me he'd been scared, the first time he'd realized he loved me. Not of the feeling. He'd cataloged the feeling fairly quickly, and in his characteristic way accepted it as a fact about his life, but of what to do about it. Because what they had, at that point, was good. What they had was a friendship that mattered and functioned and showed no signs of damage, and the risk of introducing something that could fail into something that was working was not a risk he'd wanted to take lightly. "I thought about it for 2 years," he said. "The darkness made it easier, which we'd known for a while. Every decision I make goes through a version of that process, but that one it was longer than usual." "What made you finally decide?" A pause. I realized that the risk of saying nothing had also become unacceptable. Another pause. "I was watching you at the thing, the fundraiser, talking to someone, I don't even remember who, and you were doing that thing where you actually listen, where you give someone your whole attention, and I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought, I can't do this for another year. I cannot keep watching you be exactly who you are and not say anything about it." The calculus had changed. He was quiet for a moment. "So I said something." "You said something," I agreed. "In the car park, after the fundraiser." "In the car park, after the fundraiser. Very romantic." It was romantic. I was trying not to shake. I rolled onto my side to look at him, though the dark made it more a matter of knowing he was there than actually seeing him. "You were not shaking." "Inside," he said, "impeccably composed outside." "That," I said, "is you in a complete nutshell." "Probably." I thought about that night, the cold car park, the yellow overhead lights, the way he'd come to stand beside me while I looked for my keys, and had said, in a voice that was completely level and only slightly too careful, "I think I should tell you something." And then had told me, clearly and directly, and entirely without performance, which was somehow more exposing than any dramatic declaration could have been. I'd cried, which I hadn't expected. Not sad crying, not even overwhelmed crying. More the kind that happens when something long awaited and half believed finally arrives. He'd looked alarmed and then relieved in quick succession when I explained the crying. "I didn't know," I said now, "that it had been 2 years for you." "I know, you thought it was recent." "I thought something had changed." Nothing had changed. I had just stopped being able to not say it. I reached across and found his hand in the dark. I'm glad you stopped. Me too. We lay like that for a while, hands linked between us, the fire making small sounds as the last of the wood went to embers. What would you have done, I said, if I'd said no? A brief silence. Continued being your friend, found a way to manage it. He said it without melodrama, as though he'd actually worked out the answer to this question at some point, and filed it away. I didn't want to lose the friendship. The friendship was, another pause. It was everything, Sean. Even before the rest. It was still everything. It still is, I said. I know. He squeezed my hand. That's the best part. I thought about that. About friendship as the foundation, rather than the consolation. About the years of running paths and early mornings and long evenings and the slow, patient accumulation of knowing someone, before the church, before the ring, before the card dated January 14th, just the knowing. The two of us in our orbit, making it our home, even before we named it that. Ron. This is the best anniversary. A pause. Then quietly, even accounting for Wednesday? Especially accounting for Wednesday. I settled closer. Because you had this plan since January, and the card, and the fireplace, and you thought about the thing I said once, about the fireplace. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. I pay attention to you. I know, I always have. Even before. I know. I just want you to know that I know, he said. That the anniversary happening like it did, the way Wednesday landed, I don't want that to be the one that stays. I want this one to be the one that stays. I thought about the stripe of morning light, the cold cove, his feet on shingle, the card in my pocket, the soup too hot to hold, walking back up the hill in the dark. It is, I said. Trust me, this is the one that stays. The fire was mostly embers now, warm and low. The sea went on outside, permanent and unconcerned. He pulled me close and I let him, and the room was the temperature of somewhere you're supposed to be. And I thought, 2 years of marriage, 3 of love, indeterminate years of friendship before that, winding their long way to a car park and a conversation that changed everything. And now this, a room above the sea, his heartbeat under my ear, making something beautiful, out of cold light and limited expectations. This, I thought, let this be the one that stays. Sunday arrived gently, a pale, overcast morning with no drama, the sea back to its gray and silver, the February light doing its best. We packed in comfortable quiet, moving around each other in the easy choreography of people who have shared spaces long enough to know the steps. He carried both bags to the car. I went back to check we hadn't left anything. We had. It was his charger, which was in the same place chargers always hide, and from which we had apparently not yet learned. Checkout was brief and warm. The woman at the desk, different from Friday, a younger person with a pleasant efficiency, said she hoped we'd enjoyed our stay. Ron said we had, and thank you, and there was something in the simple confidence of the way he said it that I had always found quietly extraordinary. He moved through the world with such ease, not the ease of someone who didn't notice difficulty. He noticed everything, but the ease of someone who had made a settled peace with his own navigation of it. We drove back with the radio on low and the heater doing its job, and the winter landscape traveling past us in both directions, the bare fields and the pale sky and the occasional town. I had the card in my jacket pocket. I was aware of it there, not as an obligation, but as a kept thing, something to go in the box in the wardrobe with the other notes, the whole accumulation of him. At some point on the motorway, I fell asleep, which I hadn't done in a car since I was about 12, and which surprised me slightly when I woke to find us nearly home. The city returning around us, familiar streets. You were asleep, he said. I noticed. You snored. That is a complete fabrication. Mildly, very dignified. His eyes were on the road, but his mouth was doing something. I object to this characterization. Note it. I looked out at the returning city, the streets we knew, the corner shop, the turning we always nearly missed and always caught, the neighborhood and then the road, and then the house, sitting there as it always did, slightly in need of the gutter repair we kept putting off, but ours, completely and specifically ours. He got the bags. I unlocked the door. The house had the familiar smell of our life together, the particular combination of wood and coffee and the old rugs and something that had no precise description, but meant home to me in my bones. The cat from next door was somehow on our front step, regarding us with the settled judgment of a creature that had decided to make our threshold its business, and saw no reason to justify the decision. Off you go, I told it. It declined. We left it to it. Inside, the house rearranged itself around us as it always did. Bags in the hall, kettle on, the afternoon light moving through the kitchen window in its particular winter angle. Ron was already looking at his phone, scrolling through what the weekend had generated, and I let him. Monday was close enough now to let it approach. I made tea and stood at the window and looked at the garden, winter bare and still, and thought about the weekend, the beach and the restaurant and the fire and the dark, and his voice in the late night room, telling me things the daytime didn't always make room for. The card in my pocket, the drive home. He came and stood beside me with his own mug, looking out at the same garden. Thank you, I said, for January 14th, for the fireplace, for paying attention, for the car park years ago, and for everything after. He looked at me sideways. What for? Everything. All of it. He leaned over and pressed his lips briefly to my temple. His mug was warm against my arm. Happy anniversary, he said. 2 days late, perfectly on time. Happy anniversary, I said back. Outside, the February afternoon went about its business. The neighbor's cat continued to occupy our step with undiminished authority. The kettle finished. The garden waited for spring, the way gardens do, patient and certain, knowing exactly what was coming in no particular hurry to prove it. We stood at the window together and watched the light change. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story. And if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me.